What would you do if someone told you that you didn't belong somewhere, even when you had every right to be there? That's exactly what happened to Sergeant Marcus Carter, a dedicated soldier returning home from deployment, when a man refused to let him sit in first class simply because of who he was. But what Marcus did next left everyone on that flight speechless. Stick around, because this story has a twist you won't see coming. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one, filled with moments that inspire surprise and remind us of what really matters. The airport was buzzing with its usual chaos, voices echoing through terminals, hurried footsteps, and the endless announcements over the PA system. Among the crowd, Sergeant Marcus Carter walked with purpose, though his shoulders carried the invisible weight of months spent overseas. His olive green uniform, slightly faded and wrinkled, told a story of long days and even longer nights. Marcus had just completed an exhausting deployment, the kind that not only tested his physical limits but left deep emotional scars that couldn't be seen. For months, he had lived through grueling conditions, made countless sacrifices, and witnessed moments that would stay with him forever. Now, all he wanted was to get home. Home to his family. Home to peace and quiet. Dragging his heavy duffel bag through the airport, Marcus stood out in the crowd. Travelers in business suits with rolling luggage barely glanced his way. Some offered a polite nod, recognizing his uniform, but most walked past as if he were invisible. It didn't bother him much. He was used to it by now. As he reached the airline counter to check in, Marcus shifted his bag, feeling the strain in his shoulder. The clerk, a kind-looking woman in her early 40s, glanced at his uniform and then at her computer screen. After a brief moment of typing, she looked up with a smile. "Sergeant Carter, we've upgraded you to first class," she said, handing him his boarding pass. Marcus blinked in surprise. "First class? Are you sure?" She nodded. "Consider it a small thank you for your service." Grateful, but slightly uncomfortable, Marcus took the boarding pass and thanked her. It wasn't every day he got this kind of treatment, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. As he made his way to the security checkpoint, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride for being acknowledged, but also a sense of unease about standing out in such a way. Walking through the terminal, Marcus noticed the occasional curious glance directed his way. Some people smiled at him, a silent acknowledgement of his uniform. Others gave him quick, furtive looks before turning away. He wasn't sure if it was respect, curiosity, or something else entirely, but he tried to brush it off. His mind was too focused on getting to the gate and, eventually, to the comfort of his own home. The buzz of activity around him felt almost surreal. Families were reuniting with hugs and tears. Business travelers were glued to their phones, and vacationers chatted excitedly about their plans. For Marcus, this was all background noise. His thoughts were occupied with memories of his deployment. The faces of the friends he had made, some of whom didn't make it back. The harsh conditions he had endured, and the moments when he doubted he'd ever see home again. He finally reached his gate and found a seat in the waiting area. Setting his duffel bag down, he leaned back and let out a long breath. It was the first time in months he could truly relax, or at least try to. The hum of conversations around him was almost soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind overseas. When the announcement came for first-class passengers to board, Marcus hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to this kind of privilege, and the thought of walking past the long line of coach passengers made him feel out of place. But his exhaustion won out. Slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder, he made his way to the front of the line. The flight attendant greeted him warmly as he stepped onto the plane. Her smile widened slightly when she saw his uniform. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. "Thank you for your service," she said, motioning toward the first-class cabin. Marcus nodded politely and made his way to his seat, 3A. The plush leather chair was far more comfortable than anything he had expected. As he sank into it, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Around him, the other first-class passengers were settling in, businessmen in sharp suits, a woman scrolling through her tablet, and a man adjusting his designer tie. They all looked like they belonged there. Marcus wasn't so sure he did. For a brief moment, Marcus closed his eyes and allowed himself to relax. The soft hum of the airplane's air conditioning and the faint chatter of passengers around him provided a comforting background noise. He thought about how far he had come, not just in miles, but in the challenges he had overcome. It was strange, he thought, to be in first class. It felt worlds apart from the cramped quarters of military transport planes he was used to. The legroom alone was a luxury he hadn't experienced in years. But the difference wasn't just physical. It was the atmosphere, the quiet hum of wealth and privilege that surrounded him. Marcus opened his eyes and glanced around. A man across the aisle was on his laptop typing furiously. Another passenger was sipping champagne, flipping through a magazine. Marcus shifted in his seat, feeling the unfamiliar softness of the leather. It was comfortable, sure, but it also felt foreign. He wasn't sure he'd ever get used to it. As he adjusted his seatbelt, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced toward the aisle and noticed a man standing a few rows back, staring at him with a look that was hard to interpret. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. He was used to being noticed in his uniform. But something about this man's expression unsettled him. He brushed it off and turned his attention back to his seat, deciding to enjoy this rare moment of comfort while it lasted. Little did he know, this flight was about to take a very unexpected turn. The plane's cabin was beginning to settle into a quiet rhythm. Passengers were stowing their bags, flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering assistance, and the hum of conversation ebbed and flowed like background music. Marcus adjusted his duffel bag beneath his seat, taking a moment to breathe deeply. He could finally feel the day's weight beginning to lift. The soft leather of the seat was unlike anything he'd experienced in years, and though it felt foreign, he wasn't about to complain. For once, he had room to stretch his legs. But the moment of calm didn't last long. As Marcus leaned back, his head just beginning to settle into the cushion, he noticed movement in the aisle. A man was making his way toward him. He was tall, sharply dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, complete with polished leather shoes and an expensive watch that glinted under the cabin lights. His hair was slicked back, and everything about him exuded an air of confidence, or perhaps arrogance. Marcus caught a quick glance at the man's expression and knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a friendly encounter. The man stopped abruptly in the aisle, just beside Marcus's row. For a brief moment he stood there, his eyes darting between Marcus and the seat number above. There was no mistaking the look of disbelief on his face. His brow furrowed, and his lips pressed together in a thin line, as if trying to process what he was seeing. "Excuse me," the man said sharply, his tone more accusatory than polite. Marcus turned his head to meet the man's gaze, which was now fixed squarely on him. "Yes," Marcus responded, keeping his tone neutral. "I believe you're in the wrong seat," the man continued, his voice clipped. "This is first class." Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He straightened slightly in his seat and reached into his pocket for his boarding pass. "No, this is my seat," he said calmly, holding out the ticket for the man to see. 3A, it's right here." The man leaned in, glancing at the ticket with a skeptical glare. He frowned, clearly not expecting this response. "You're telling me this is your seat? You're in first class?" He enunciated the words as if they were somehow incomprehensible. "That's right," Marcus said evenly, refusing to let the man's tone affect him. The man's expression shifted into something closer to annoyance. He straightened up, looking around as if searching for someone to validate his disbelief. "I don't mean to be rude, but aren't you a soldier? Shouldn't you be in coach?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He was no stranger to these kinds of assumptions, but they still had a way of stinging every time. Taking a measured breath, he resisted the urge to respond in kind. Instead, he said, "This is the seat that was assigned to me." The man scoffed, shaking his head slightly. "There must have been some kind of mix-up," he muttered, almost to himself, though loud enough for Marcus to hear. He placed his hand on the headrest of the seat in front of Marcus and leaned in again. "Look, maybe you should check with the flight attendant. This is first class," he repeated, as if Marcus hadn't understood him the first time. Marcus kept his composure, but the knot of frustration in his chest was growing. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him now. Some were subtle, stealing quick glances from behind newspapers or phones. Others were less discreet, openly watching the exchange with mild curiosity. The air in the cabin had shifted. What had been a quiet, comfortable space now felt stifling and tense. "I don't need to check with anyone," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This is my seat." The man's eyes narrowed, and he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to intervene. "I just don't understand how—" He stopped mid-sentence as the sound of footsteps approached. One of the flight attendants had noticed the commotion and was making her way toward them. She was a petite woman with a practiced smile, her uniform crisp and her demeanor calm despite the tension in the air. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice polite but carrying an edge of authority. The man straightened up, adjusting his suit jacket as he turned to face her. "Yes," he said quickly, gesturing toward Marcus. "There seems to be a mistake. This gentleman is in my seat." The flight attendant looked from the man to Marcus, her expression carefully neutral. "May I see your ticket, sir?" she asked Marcus. Marcus handed her the boarding pass without a word. She examined it briefly before nodding and handing it back. "Sergeant Carter's seat is 3A, she said firmly. "He's in the correct seat." The man's face flushed a deep shade of red, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "But, isn't he—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus's uniform, as if that explained everything. The flight attendant's smile tightened slightly. "Sergeant Carter is a first-class passenger," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she added, turning to Marcus with a respectful nod. Marcus nodded back, murmuring, "Thank you," though he couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. He had hoped the situation would end there, but the man wasn't quite finished. "Well, where's my seat then?" he asked, his tone now more defensive than accusatory. The flight attendant consulted her list before replying, "Your seat is in 5A, sir, just a couple of rows back." The man opened his mouth as if to argue but closed it again, realizing he was drawing even more attention to himself. With a huff of irritation, he turned on his heel and stalked down the aisle, his footsteps heavy with indignation. As he passed, a few passengers exchanged knowing looks, some rolling their eyes at his behavior. Marcus exhaled slowly, his grip on the armrests loosening. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, though the lingering sting of the encounter remained. He glanced around the cabin and noticed a few sympathetic smiles from nearby passengers. But there were still others who avoided his gaze, their expressions unreadable. As he settled back into his seat, Marcus tried to push the incident from his mind. He had dealt with worse, far worse, but no matter how many times he encountered prejudice, it never seemed to hurt any less. The words weren't what stung the most, it was the assumptions behind them. The idea that, in the eyes of some, his uniform, his service, and his sacrifices still weren't enough to earn him a place in their world. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Marcus closed his eyes, focusing on the hum of the engines. He had survived countless challenges before, and this was just another bump in the road. But as the plane lifted into the air, he couldn't help but wonder if this man's attitude was an isolated incident or just one more reminder of a deeper problem. The murmurs of passengers were still faintly audible as the flight attendant stepped closer, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp with attentiveness. She had been moving through the cabin, ensuring everyone was settled, when the raised voices near Marcus's row caught her attention. It wasn't loud enough to cause a scene yet, but it carried an unmistakable edge of tension. Stopping beside them, she smiled politely, the kind of practiced expression that masked her experience with countless difficult passengers over the years. Her gaze shifted between Marcus and Thomas, quickly assessing the dynamics of the situation. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Thomas, who was now visibly irritated, gestured toward Marcus with a stiff wave of his hand. "Yes, there is. This man is sitting in my seat," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "I don't know what kind of mix-up has happened, but I paid for first class and I expect to have the seat I reserved." The flight attendant turned her gaze to Marcus, who was sitting quietly, his face calm but his posture slightly rigid. "Sir," she said, addressing Marcus, "may I please see your boarding pass?" Marcus nodded, handing over the ticket without hesitation. She examined it briefly, her eyes scanning the seat number and passenger name. Then she glanced back at Thomas, her professional smile still intact but her tone firm. "Sergeant Carter is in the correct seat," she said evenly, returning the boarding pass to Marcus. 3A is assigned to him. Thomas blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "He's a soldier. Shouldn't he be in coach or something? I mean, this is first class." The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of several nearby passengers. A few heads turned, while others exchanged furtive glances. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable, but no one spoke. The cabin seemed to grow quieter as the confrontation unfolded. The flight attendant's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing her features before she quickly recovered. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully measured, "Sergeant Carter's seat was assigned by the airline. He is exactly where he is supposed to be." Thomas let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his tone loud enough for everyone around them to hear. "I don't understand how someone like him ends up in first class while people like me are being sent to the back of the plane." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his hands resting on his knees as he focused on keeping his composure. He had dealt with this kind of prejudice before, and he knew how quickly it could escalate if he reacted. Still, the man's words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. The flight attendant straightened her posture slightly, her demeanor shifting from polite to resolute. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument, "your seat is in 5A, just a couple of rows back. I suggest you take your seat so we can ensure an on-time departure." Thomas opened his mouth to argue further, but hesitated. His face turned red, a mix of frustration and embarrassment coloring his features as he realized he wasn't going to win this argument. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low but dripping with disdain. He grabbed his carry-on bag and stepped back into the aisle, pausing just long enough to throw one last glance at Marcus. As he moved toward his seat, he muttered something under his breath, the words too low for anyone to catch, but clear enough in their intent. Marcus could feel the hostility radiating from the man even as he walked away. It was a palpable weight, one that lingered long after Thomas had taken his place in 5A. The flight attendant turned back to Marcus, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you for your patience, Sergeant," she said, "and thank you for your service." Marcus nodded, offering her a faint smile. "Thank you," he replied quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. As she moved on to assist other passengers, Marcus leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The tension in his shoulders eased, but only slightly. He glanced around the cabin, noticing how some passengers quickly averted their gazes when he looked their way. Others offered him small, polite smiles, as if to compensate for what had just happened. But there were still those who sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. The man's words echoed in his mind, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were all too familiar. This wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. In his years of service, Marcus had encountered prejudice in many forms. Sometimes it was overt, like the confrontation with Thomas. Other times it was subtle. A look, a tone, a hesitation in someone's voice. It didn't matter how many sacrifices he made, how many sleepless nights he endured, or how many times he put his life on the line. To some people, he would always be defined by the color of his skin or the uniform he wore. But Marcus had learned long ago that he couldn't let these moments define him. He thought back to the values instilled in him by his parents, who had always taught him to stand tall and remain true to himself, no matter what. They had faced their own battles against prejudice, and their resilience had been passed down to him. Still, that didn't make it any easier. The sting of being judged, of being seen as less than, was a pain that never truly went away. It lingered, a quiet ache that surfaced in moments like this, reminding him of how far society still had to go. He opened his eyes, gazing out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a soothing sound that helped to drown out the lingering tension. Marcus took another deep breath, focusing on the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He reminded himself that he had faced far greater challenges than this. This was just one man's ignorance, one moment in a long journey home. As the plane lifted into the air, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. The ground beneath him faded away, and with it some of the weight he had been carrying. He didn't know what the rest of the flight would bring, but he resolved not to let Thomas's prejudice ruin his day. For Marcus, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder of the resilience that had carried him through countless battles, on the field and off. And though the scars of prejudice ran deep, he knew that his strength, his dignity, and his unwavering sense of purpose were far greater than any words a man like Thomas could throw at him. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the first-class section. The hum of the engines became a steady backdrop, soothing in its consistency as the world outside the window turned into a patchwork of clouds and sky. Marcus stared out at the horizon, watching the sunlight dance across the endless expanse of white below. The earlier confrontation with Thomas still lingered in his mind, but as the plane leveled off, he allowed himself to shift focus. The man's ignorance wasn't worth the energy it would take to dwell on it. Instead, Marcus's thoughts began to drift, pulled toward the life he had lived before this moment, before this plane, this uniform, this fleeting encounter with hostility. It wasn't something he reflected on often, but being 30,000 feet above ground had a way of making the past feel closer. Marcus had joined the military straight out of high school. For him, it wasn't just a career choice. It was a path out of a life that felt stagnant. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, opportunities had always seemed limited. His father worked long hours at a factory, and his mother balanced multiple jobs to keep food on the table. The family was close-knit, but the strain of making ends meet weighed heavily on all of them. The military, for Marcus, was a way to create a better life, not just for himself but for his family. He still remembered the day he enlisted, standing in the recruiter's office with a mixture of nerves and excitement coursing through his veins. It was the first step toward something bigger, something that promised meaning and purpose. But the military was far from easy. Marcus learned that quickly during basic training. The physical demands were grueling, and the mental strain even more so. Yet, amidst the challenges, he found something unexpected: camaraderie. In his unit, people came from all walks of life, different races, religions, and backgrounds. It didn't matter where they had come from or what they believed. They were all there for the same purpose, and that commonality forged bonds that Marcus knew would last a lifetime. He thought back to his first deployment, a tour in Afghanistan that had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The harsh desert environment, the constant threat of danger, and the long stretches of time away from home were all challenges he had to navigate. But it was the moments in between. The quiet conversations with his comrades, the shared laughter during rare moments of levity that stuck with him the most. Marcus's thoughts shifted to one comrade in particular, Private Ethan Ramirez. Ethan was a wiry kid from Texas with a quick wit and an infectious laugh that could cut through even the darkest days. The two of them had become fast friends, bonding over their shared love of basketball and their dreams for the future. Marcus had often joked that Ethan's humor was what kept their unit sane during the toughest times. One memory stood out above the rest: a night under the stars, the desert sky stretching endlessly above them. The unit had been on a grueling mission for days, and exhaustion hung heavy over everyone. But Ethan, as always, found a way to lighten the mood. He had started telling stories, wildly exaggerated tales about his childhood in Texas, complete with hilarious impressions of his family members. The laughter that rippled through the group that night was a rare and precious thing, a reminder of their humanity in the midst of chaos. But the laughter didn't last forever. Marcus's chest tightened as his mind replayed the events of a day he would never forget. It had been a routine patrol, the kind they had done countless times before. But this time, an IED hidden along the roadside had turned routine into tragedy. Ethan had been one of the casualties. The memory hit Marcus like a wave, as vivid and raw as the day it happened. He could still hear the deafening explosion, feel the scorching heat, and see the dust cloud that obscured everything in its path. The chaos that followed was a blur of shouting and movement, but the image of Ethan lying still on the ground was burned into Marcus's mind. He had carried Ethan's loss with him ever since. It was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of the cost of service and the fragility of life. But it was also a source of strength. Marcus had vowed to honor Ethan's memory by living a life of purpose, by holding on to the values they had both believed in. It was those values that made moments like the one with Thomas so hard to reconcile. In the military, Marcus had seen the best of humanity. He had fought alongside people of every race and creed, united by a common mission. The bonds they shared had been forged in fire, and they transcended the superficial divisions that so often plagued the world outside the military. But out here, in civilian life, those divisions were still painfully present. Thomas's words were a stark reminder of that. Marcus couldn't understand how someone could look at him, a man who had risked everything for his country, and reduce him to a stereotype. It wasn't just frustrating, it was disheartening. Yet, as he sat there in the quiet of the plane, Marcus reminded himself that people like Thomas were the exception, not the rule. He thought about the countless strangers who had thanked him for his service over the years, the kids who looked up to him with wide-eyed admiration, and the friends who had stood by him through thick and thin. They were the ones who mattered, not the narrow-minded few who clung to outdated prejudices. Still, the sting of Thomas's words lingered. Marcus knew he couldn't change everyone's mind, but he also knew he had a choice in how he responded. He could let the anger and frustration consume him, or he could rise above it. It was a lesson he had learned time and time again in the military. Resilience wasn't about ignoring pain. It was about finding strength in the face of it. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks. Marcus declined politely, his mind still occupied with his reflections. He thought about Ethan again, about the laughter they had shared and the bond they had built. He thought about the countless others he had served with, men and women who had become like family to him. The prejudice he had faced that day hurt, but it also reminded him of the importance of the values he held dear: respect, understanding, and unity. They were the same values that had brought his unit together, the same values that had carried him through the darkest days of his life. As Marcus looked out the window, the sunlight reflecting off the clouds below, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't control how others saw him, but he could control how he lived his life. And for him, that meant holding on to the lessons he had learned in the military. The lessons of sacrifice, resilience, and the power of human connection. Ethan's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from one of their many conversations. "You can't change the world overnight, man," Ethan had said, grinning as he tossed a basketball back and forth with Marcus. "But if you can change one person's perspective, that's a start." Marcus nodded to himself, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Ethan had been right, and maybe, just maybe, this flight would give him the chance to do just that. The hum of the airplane engines provided a steady rhythm, a kind of white noise that seemed to settle over the cabin like a soft blanket. Marcus had spent the better part of the flight trying to focus on anything other than the earlier confrontation with Thomas. He had replayed the exchange in his mind more times than he cared to admit, each time feeling the same tight knot of frustration in his chest. No matter how much he tried to brush it off, the man's words had left a mark. It wasn't just the words themselves that stung, it was the assumption behind them. The assumption that Marcus didn't belong, that his presence in first class was somehow a mistake. Despite his uniform, despite the sacrifices he had made, he had still been judged not by his actions or character, but by someone else's narrow view of the world. Marcus stared out the window, his eyes tracing the endless expanse of clouds below. He had faced far greater challenges than this, he reminded himself. His years in the military had taught him resilience, patience, and the importance of keeping a clear head in the face of adversity. But the lesson that stuck with him most was one he had learned from his comrades: the power of human connection. In the military, bonds were forged not by where you came from or what you looked like, but by the shared experiences and mutual respect that grew from them. That sense of unity had carried Marcus through some of the darkest moments of his life. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed to embody the opposite of those values. His attitude was a reminder of how far society still had to go, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at the thought. Yet, he also knew that meeting ignorance with anger wasn't the answer. Anger might feel justified in the moment, but it rarely changed hearts or minds. If anything, it only deepened the divide. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as he considered his next move. He couldn't let the situation go unaddressed. That much he knew. But how? Confronting Thomas directly risked escalating the tension, and Marcus wasn't interested in causing a scene. He needed another way to communicate his thoughts, something that would challenge Thomas's perspective without creating further conflict. His gaze drifted to his duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him. Reaching down, he unzipped the side pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen. Writing had always been a source of solace for Marcus, a way to process his thoughts and put them into words. Perhaps this could be his way of responding, not with anger, but with honesty and sincerity. Settling back into his seat, Marcus flipped open the notepad, the blank page staring up at him. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, letting the pen hover over the paper before he began to write. "Dear Sir, I wanted to take a moment to address what happened earlier. I understand that there was some confusion about my seat, and I appreciate the flight attendant for clarifying the situation. However, I feel it's important to speak openly about something that has been on my mind since our interaction. First and foremost, I want you to know that I am proud to serve my country. It has been one of the greatest honors of my life to wear this uniform and to play a small role in protecting the freedoms we all enjoy. Those freedoms are not abstract to me. I have seen their cost firsthand. I have stood alongside men and women from all walks of life, people who look different, believe different, and come from places you may never have heard of. And yet, in those moments, none of those differences mattered. What mattered was the bond we shared, the respect we had for one another, and the mission that united us." Marcus paused, his pen resting lightly against the page. Memories of his comrades flickered through his mind, faces and names he would never forget. People like Ethan Ramirez, who had taught him the value of laughter in the face of adversity, and Staff Sergeant Leah Daniels, whose quiet strength had been a source of inspiration during their most harrowing missions. These were the people who had shaped Marcus's understanding of humanity, who had shown him the beauty of unity and diversity. He took another deep breath and continued writing. "I have always believed that kindness and understanding are the cornerstones of a better world. It is easy to judge someone based on appearances, to make assumptions about who they are or where they belong. But when we take the time to look beyond those surface-level differences, we often find that we have more in common than we realize. We are all human, with hopes, fears, dreams, and struggles that shape us. When I boarded this flight today, I was looking forward to a quiet journey home after months of deployment overseas. I didn't expect to face judgment or assumptions about my place here, but I want you to know that your words did not make me angry. Instead, they made me reflect on the challenges we all face in learning to see each other for who we truly are." Marcus's hand stilled for a moment, his eyes scanning the words he had written. He wanted to strike the right balance, firm yet compassionate, honest but not accusatory. The note wasn't just for Thomas. It was a reminder to himself of the values he wanted to uphold, even in the face of prejudice. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the tray table as he continued. "I hope this note encourages you to consider a different perspective. We all have the capacity to grow, to learn, and to challenge the biases we carry, whether we realize we have them or not. It takes courage to confront those biases, to question the assumptions we've been taught, and to choose kindness over judgment. But it is a courage worth cultivating. In my time serving this country, I have seen the best and worst of humanity. I have witnessed incredible acts of compassion and sacrifice, as well as the pain that ignorance and division can cause. And through it all, I have held on to the belief that we are more alike than we are different. Thank you for taking the time to read this. My hope is that it leaves you with something to think about, not just about me, but about the world we all share. Sincerely, Sergeant Marcus Carter. Marcus set the pen down, reading over the note one final time. It wasn't perfect, but it captured what he wanted to say. It wasn't about changing Thomas's mind in an instant. That kind of transformation took time. But if the note could plant even the smallest seed of understanding, then it was worth it. Carefully, Marcus folded the note and placed it in an envelope he had tucked into the back of the notepad. He called over the flight attendant, who approached with a curious but warm smile. "Could you do me a favor?" Marcus asked, holding out the envelope. "Could you deliver this to the man in seat 5A?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the envelope and then back to Marcus. She seemed to sense the gravity of the gesture and nodded. "Of course," she said, taking the note. "I'll make sure he gets it." As she walked away, Marcus leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The knot in his chest had loosened, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. Whatever happened next was out of his hands, but he felt at peace knowing he had chosen to respond with grace rather than resentment. In the end, that was the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of man his comrades, his family, and his country could be proud of. The hum of the engines provided a constant backdrop to the quiet activity in the cabin. Most passengers had settled into their own routines by now, some immersed in books or scrolling through their phones, others sipping their drinks or chatting softly with the person beside them. But Marcus's attention was elsewhere, focused entirely on the flight attendant as she walked toward the back of the first-class section, the folded note in her hand. From his seat, Marcus could see Thomas in 5A, his rigid posture and stiff movements a clear indication that he was still stewing over their earlier interaction. Thomas sat with his arms crossed, staring out the window as though he were deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone in the cabin. The flight attendant approached him, her professional demeanor unwavering as she leaned down slightly to speak to him. "Sir," she said softly, "this is for you." Thomas turned his head, his expression initially one of confusion. His brow furrowed as he glanced at the note she held out to him. He looked up at her, then at the note again, as though trying to piece together why he was being handed an envelope in the middle of the flight. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached out and took it from her fingers. "Who's it from?" he asked, his tone curt. The flight attendant straightened and smiled politely. "It's from Sergeant Carter," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "He wanted you to have it." At the mention of Marcus's name, Thomas's expression shifted. His confusion deepened, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even unease. He glanced toward Marcus's row, but didn't hold his gaze there for long. Instead, he turned the note over in his hands, as though inspecting it for some hidden motive. The flight attendant gave him a small nod and stepped away, returning to her duties. As she moved past Marcus, she offered him a brief, understanding smile, but Marcus didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Thomas now, watching intently as the man unfolded the note with deliberate slowness. At first, Thomas's face was unreadable, his expression carefully guarded. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and his mouth pressed into a firm line. But as he continued reading, the tension in his features began to shift. The furrow in his brow softened slightly, and the set of his jaw loosened. He leaned back in his seat, holding the note closer to his face as though the words required his full attention. From where he sat, Marcus couldn't see the exact expression on Thomas's face, but he could feel the energy in the cabin subtly shift. Nearby passengers, who had seemed indifferent moments ago, now glanced over at Thomas with a mixture of curiosity and intrigue. Some had noticed the interaction between him and the flight attendant, while others were simply drawn to the sudden intensity in Thomas's demeanor. Thomas read the note once, then paused. His hand rested on the edge of his armrest, gripping it lightly as he stared at the page in front of him. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his gaze unfocused as if the words he had just read were still echoing in his mind. Then, as though compelled by some unseen force, he began reading the note again, his eyes moving more slowly this time, lingering on certain lines. Marcus watched all of this unfold from his seat, his heart pounding slightly despite his outward composure. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he decided to write the note. He hadn't written it to get an apology or to make a scene. He had simply wanted to address the situation in a way that aligned with his values. But now, as he watched Thomas's reaction, he found himself wondering whether his words had managed to make any impact. Thomas's expression was harder to read the second time he went through the note. His lips parted slightly, and his eyes darted toward the window, though they didn't seem to focus on anything outside. His fingers tightened around the edge of the note, and for a moment, it looked as though he might crumple it in his hand. But then he stopped, letting out a long, audible sigh as he placed the note on the tray table in front of him. The cabin seemed to hold its breath in those few seconds. Though no one spoke, the tension was palpable, as though every passenger nearby was silently waiting to see what Thomas would do next. Even the flight attendants, who had been moving up and down the aisle with practiced efficiency, seemed to slow their movements, their eyes flicking towards Thomas and then quickly away. Marcus shifted in his seat, his hands resting on his knees as he tried to maintain his own calm. He couldn't hear Thomas's thoughts, but he could see the struggle playing out in the man's body language. There was something unmistakably human about it. The way Thomas tapped his fingers against the armrest, the way his shoulders rose and fell as he took deep, measured breaths. It was as though he were wrestling with some internal conflict, one that Marcus could only hope his words had helped to spark. Finally, Thomas picked up the note again. This time, he didn't read it immediately. Instead, he held it in both hands, staring at it as though the paper itself held some profound meaning. His expression softened further, and for the first time Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something resembling remorse cross the man's face. Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions watching this unfold. There was relief, certainly, a sense that perhaps his decision to write the note had been the right one. But there was also a lingering uncertainty, a quiet fear that even the most heartfelt words might not be enough to change someone's deeply ingrained biases. He had learned long ago that prejudice wasn't something that could be erased with a single conversation, a single gesture, or even a single lifetime. It was a process, and it required a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. For the remainder of the flight, Thomas didn't look in Marcus's direction. He kept the note on his tray table, occasionally glancing down at it as though it were a puzzle he was still trying to solve. Marcus, meanwhile, remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on the window as he tried to let go of his own tension. He had done what he could, and now the outcome was out of his hands. The other passengers gradually returned to their own activities, the earlier tension in the cabin fading into a more subdued atmosphere. But Marcus couldn't help but notice the occasional glance from those seated nearby, some curious, some thoughtful, and some simply acknowledging his presence in a way that felt subtly different than before. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus allowed himself to relax slightly. He didn't know what Thomas was thinking, and he didn't need to. What mattered was that he had chosen to respond with dignity, with compassion, and with the hope that his words might inspire change, even if only in a small way. The clouds outside the window stretched endlessly into the distance, their soft, shifting shapes a reminder of the vastness of the world. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting once again to the people who had shaped his journey, the friends he had lost, the comrades who had stood by him, and the family waiting for him at home. In that moment, he felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that no matter what came next, he had stayed true to the values that defined him. As the captain announced the plane's descent, the cabin came to life. Passengers began shifting in their seats, gathering their belongings, and preparing for the landing. The quiet hum of the flight was replaced by the low murmur of conversations and the occasional click of seatbelts being fastened. Marcus adjusted his seat upright and glanced out the window, watching as the world below came into focus. He let out a slow breath, preparing himself for the next leg of his journey. Home was just a little closer now. But as the plane tilted gently, signaling its final approach, Marcus noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning his head slightly, he saw Thomas standing a few feet away, hesitating in the aisle. Marcus's first thought was that the man was trying to retrieve something from the overhead bin, but when their eyes briefly met, he realized Thomas had another purpose in mind. The businessman's expression was no longer rigid or defensive. His shoulders were less tense, and his face carried a look that Marcus hadn't seen earlier: humility. For a brief moment, Thomas seemed unsure of himself, as though debating whether or not to speak. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped closer. "Sergeant Carter?" Thomas began, his voice softer than Marcus expected. "Could I have a word with you?" Marcus straightened in his seat, curious but cautious. He nodded, gesturing for Thomas to continue. Thomas took a deep breath, his hand gripping the edge of the seat in front of him for support. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "For what I said earlier, for how I acted. It was uncalled for, and frankly, it was wrong." The sincerity in Thomas's tone caught Marcus off guard. He studied the man's face, noting the way his gaze dropped briefly to the floor before returning to meet Marcus's eyes. This wasn't the same man who had confronted him earlier with accusations and assumptions. Something had changed. "I made assumptions about you," Thomas continued, his voice tinged with regret. "Assumptions I had no right to make. And reading your note, well, it made me realize just how narrow-minded I've been." Marcus nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He didn't interrupt, sensing that Thomas had more to say. The businessman shifted his weight, his hands fidgeting slightly. "You see," he said, his voice quieter now, "my brother was in the military. He served in Afghanistan about 10 years ago. We were close, but when he came back, he wasn't the same. He struggled, mentally, emotionally, and I didn't know how to help him. He ended up taking his own life." Thomas paused, his eyes glistening as he glanced away, trying to steady himself. Marcus felt a pang of empathy in his chest. He understood the toll military service could take, not just on those who served, but on their families as well. "I think," Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion, "the part of me resented the military for what happened to him. It's not fair, I know. It wasn't the military's fault, but I've been carrying this bitterness for years, and I think I let that bitterness cloud my judgment. When I saw you sitting there, it wasn't about you, it was about me, my anger, my grief, and that's no excuse." Thomas looked directly at Marcus now, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and sincerity. "I'm sorry for projecting all of that onto you. You didn't deserve it. And after reading your note, I realized how much you've given, how much you've sacrificed for people like me. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude." For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, the hum of the cabin fading into the background. Marcus could see the pain in Thomas's eyes, the weight of a loss that had clearly shaped him in ways he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. And in that moment, Marcus felt his own anger and frustration melt away, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. "Thank you for saying that," Marcus said, his voice steady but warm. "I'm sorry about your brother. Losing someone you care about is never easy, and I can't imagine the pain you've carried all these years. But I appreciate you sharing that with me." Thomas nodded, his lips pressing together as he tried to compose himself. "It's been a long time coming," he admitted. "And your note, it reminded me of something my brother used to say. He always believed in treating people with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Marcus smiled faintly, leaning forward slightly in his seat. "It's never too late to change," he said. "What matters is that you're willing to take a step forward. We've all got things we need to work on, myself included, but the fact that you're standing here now, owning up to it, that says a lot." Thomas let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "You're kinder than I deserve," he said, shaking his head, "but thank you." He extended his hand, and Marcus didn't hesitate to take it. The handshake was firm but not overly so, a gesture that carried a sense of mutual respect. For a moment they stood there, two men from vastly different walks of life who had found common ground in an unexpected place. "Thank you for your service," Thomas said, his voice steady now. "And thank you for teaching me something today. I've got a lot to think about, and I'm grateful for the chance to make things right." Marcus nodded, releasing the handshake. "We're all in this together," he said simply. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're stronger when we focus on what unites us instead of what divides us." Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that softened the lines of his face. "You're right," he said, "and I'll remember that." As Thomas turned to return to his seat, Marcus watched him go, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The earlier tension and frustration had been replaced by a quiet understanding, a reminder of the power of compassion and the potential for change. Marcus knew that Thomas's journey wasn't over. Growth was a process, not a destination, but he was glad to have played a small part in it. The plane began its final descent, and Marcus turned his attention back to the window. The city below was coming into view now, its lights twinkling like scattered stars against the darkening sky. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of peace, knowing that even in moments of conflict there was room for connection, understanding, and perhaps even healing. The plane touched down with a slight jolt, the wheels skimming the runway before settling into a steady rhythm. A collective exhale swept through the cabin as passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings and preparing for the final steps of their journey. Marcus remained seated, his eyes on the seatbelt sign as it blinked off with a faint chime. The weight of the flight and everything that had transpired lingered in his mind, but he felt lighter somehow, as though a small but significant piece of the world had shifted into place. As he reached down to retrieve his duffel bag from beneath the seat, Marcus caught sight of Thomas rising from 5A. The man glanced over, and their eyes met briefly. There was no hesitation this time, no awkwardness or tension, just a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent extension of the truce they had found. The cabin filled with the rustle of movement as passengers filed into the aisle, retrieving bags and exchanging polite farewells with the flight attendants. Marcus waited his turn, unhurried, his thoughts drifting to the family waiting for him at the airport. He could almost hear his mother's voice and feel the warmth of her hug already. When it was finally his turn to step into the aisle, He was surprised to find Thomas waiting nearby. The businessman stood with his carry-on bag in hand, his posture relaxed but purposeful. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, Thomas matched his stride, and the two found themselves walking side by side toward the front of the plane. "I was hoping we could talk a bit more before we head out," Thomas said, his tone casual but genuine. "If that's all right with you." Marcus nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Sure," he said, keeping his voice easy. The two men moved together through the jet bridge, their steps syncing almost naturally. For a moment, neither spoke, the hum of conversations around them filling the silence. When they emerged into the terminal, the bustling energy of the airport seemed to wash over them. But Thomas gestured toward a quieter corner near the windows. "I just wanted to say again how much I appreciated your note," Thomas began, his voice steady but earnest. "It really gave me a lot to think about." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Thomas. "I'm glad it did," he replied. "That's all I was hoping for." Thomas hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the carry-on bag in his hand as though gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said about kindness and understanding, and I realized I've spent too much of my life holding on to bitterness. It's easy to blame others for what we don't understand, but that doesn't make it right." He looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. "I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to carry those biases around with me, and I want to thank you for helping me see that." Marcus felt a faint smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," he said. "And even more courage to make a change. That's something to be proud of." Thomas nodded, a small smile breaking through the seriousness of his expression. "I hope I can keep that momentum going. And if there's ever anything I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out." He pulled a sleek business card from his pocket and held it out. "I mean that. Whether it's professional, personal, or just someone to talk to, I'd like to help in any way I can." Marcus accepted the card, his fingers brushing against the embossed lettering as he studied it briefly. He looked back up at Thomas, his expression warm. "I appreciate that," he said. "And who knows, maybe I'll take you up on it one day." The two men exchanged a firm handshake, the gesture carrying a sense of finality but also possibility. It wasn't just a handshake between two individuals, it was a bridge, a quiet acknowledgement of the progress they had made in just a few hours. As Thomas turned to leave, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant Carter," he said, "and thank you for everything." "You too, Thomas," Marcus replied, watching as the businessman disappeared into the crowd. For a moment, Marcus remained where he was, the card still in his hand, before tucking it into the pocket of his duffel bag. He felt a sense of closure, but also a quiet hopefulness, a belief that even small moments of connection could spark meaningful change. Marcus made his way toward the baggage claim, his thoughts drifting back to the flight. The encounter with Thomas had been unexpected, challenging, and at times uncomfortable. But it had also been a reminder of the power of vulnerability, of the courage it took to admit our flaws and strive for something better. In his years of service, Marcus had learned that true strength wasn't about physical power or dominance, it was about empathy, resilience, and the willingness to grow. As he reached the baggage carousel, Marcus spotted his mother in the distance, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. She waved enthusiastically, and Marcus felt a wave of warmth wash over him. He was home. But he wasn't just bringing back memories of deployment. He was bringing back a renewed sense of purpose, a belief in the potential for human connection to bridge even the widest divides. If this story moved you or made you think about how we treat others, take a moment to subscribe to our channel.